You ever see one of those things where someone does something that feels like they're doing it deliberately wrong, just suboptimal, subpar, worse than they could, that kind of a thing. And then you're like, why are you doing it that way? And then it's revealed for something. I have that feeling that this episode was done that way. I've got a lot of notes. I don't know. God, there we go. A lot of notes for today. I've noticed the directing style has shifted. Well, I wrote down a note that said the directing style has shifted as of late, especially in the teasers, because each teaser for the last several episodes has been lighthearted, silly, down-to-earth thing, and then immediately cut to action! Big, loud music action. And it was starting to get irritating, if I'm being 100% honest. And I really sat back and thought about it and tried to figure out why. And I was like, okay, maybe there's just some new director making his mark. So I looked at the episodes, and every single one of them is actually a different director. And I'm like, well, in that case, it's a function of the script. And these are all episodes written by JMS himself. And then I realized what's happening. This is a theory. I don't know if this is actually true or not. But what I think is happening here is I think that the network, especially since this is about the time when the show was being reinvented, basically, thanks to the whole TNT thing I'm not going to talk about. And so they were trying to be like, look, we need you to make your teasers actual teasers. If you remember, I've commented before on how Babylon 5 hasn't actually been approaching its teasers as if they're teasers, but rather just, well, we need to fill the format of teasers because it's what we are supposed to do, so we just chop off the episode on an arbitrary point and then keep going. Now, in this case, what's happening is we have teasers as actual, hey, we're trying to get viewers to watch the show kind of a thing. And I think that's what's happening here. I do also have to mention that I like the down-to-earth sections. I always have, ever since the Zip discussion between Sinclair and Garibaldi. There's a couple of really nice ones. There's actually two really good ones in this one. The first is the bacon and eggs. It's one of those weird things, but it's so easy to understand that science fiction, and fiction in general actually, tends to forget about. Simple things are the kind of things you tend to miss when you're without them for long periods of time. They've actually done this before, with Sheridan actually. The fact that he was able to get a hold of an orange, a real orange, or actual coffee with Ivanova. And there's been a couple of other things, but the idea to get actual eggs before they spoil, and bacon, is this big, oh my god, I can't believe this has actually happened, kind of a thing. And even mentioned how Garibaldi, who, as we've already established, is kind of one of the masters of smuggling on the station. Remember when he managed to make that thick Italian meal? You remember that? It was a side plot of a whole episode. But in this case, he was never able to get eggs on the ship, or excuse me, eggs on the station. But Marcus managed it, which also kind of helps to establish Marcus's character a bit, that he's a little bit better at the character stuff, or rather, at the interpersonal stuff, as I kind of mentioned earlier. I also like the story that goes back and forth between Sheridan and Delenn, where Sheridan talks about how his dad, held up the hose on the roof. It's a nice story. It's good stuff, and it helps to connect Sheridan and Delenn more. And I like how Delenn had the ability to do that for him, basically as just a simple I care gesture. And on top of all that, it's a nice little insight into how much Sheridan cares about his father. Believe it or not, that'll come up later too. I mean, this is Babylon 5. At this point, I can point to almost any aspect of any story and say, that'll come up later. There's very few exceptions to that, especially at this point onwards, but I don't want to get too much ahead of myself. Let me go ahead and reiterate that we have a no spoilers policy for episodes after episodes we're covering currently. You can talk about anything that happens before this episode, but any comments about stuff after this episode will be censored and or deleted. This is not just because of the sake of spoilers for preserving and all that, but there are several of my viewers, and a number of which is growing, actually, of people who have never seen Babylon 5 and are watching it alongside these ruminations. Please do not spoil the awesomeness of this show for these people. That's all I ask. And of course, I'm watching the comments, so I will be censoring those comments. I am apparently President Clark in disguise. You can tell by the hair. I haven't shaved lately, but whatever, you get the point. Let's talk... God, I actually don't know where to start. There's actually a lot of things to talk about. Let's go down the list. I like how Garibaldi reaches out to Jakar and is trying to be friendly and personable with him. And there's a lot of genuine bond between them that I kind of hinted at before and has grown before, and it is pretty much effectively there. At this point, I would say Jakar does consider Garibaldi, Mr. Garibaldi, to be his friend, and I like that. I also like the light banter between the two. Oh, we're torturing you in here. And he's beginning to write his own book, the Book of Jakar. That's interesting. I wonder if anything will ever come of that, but I guess we'll find out in the future. What I really want to talk about, though, is the fact that it's very obvious that Jakar really appreciates the fact that Garibaldi is making time for him. It would have been too easy for him to be like, no, I'm meditating, go away, or I'm in the middle of writing, leave me alone. But instead, he greets Garibaldi warmly. Hey, what's going on? And he shares what he's doing and shares how he's doing it. He banters with him. He talks with him. You can tell that Jakar really does think of Garibaldi as a friend at this point, and I like that. It's funny, considering that someone else could also have claimed that at one point in time. Orlando! Oh, excuse me. So we see here the package has come into being. This is actually the package that was mentioned in the previous episode. The package in this case being this woman who is being hunted by many, many people who want her very, very dead. I've often wondered if the specific people who want her dead are the IPX people who are doing their own thing for their own corporate greed, or any of Clark's administration, or any of Psychops, all of whom have some interconnection with this whole shadow situation. But it's easy to forget that in a series that is as well written as Babylon 5, it's not all black and white. All the bad guys are not all on the same team simply by virtue of being the bad guys, after all. They also I mentioned IPX. They mentioned IPX. I just point that out because I actually forgot the name of them back in earlier episodes, but IPX has been around since Season 1, and they have been referenced here and there in a couple of episodes, and in several cases IPX has been name-dropped as being large corporation, probably some morally questionable things. And then we see this episode. Yeah. There's a little bit too much melodrama in this episode. There's a lot of scenes where it's like, what I am about to tell you will change your life forever. I mean, it's just huge pauses and big, just sweeping statements, and the music's big and bombastic. Dun, 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 dun. That's the part I think was done deliberately. I'm going to skip ahead in my notes a little bit, because I think there's two things behind this. First, I think that this is to help emphasize the end of the episode. Forgive me for skipping ahead, but the very end of the episode doesn't end on a big... It's actually very simple, very calm. It's just a news reporter saying in simple, calm tones that martial law has been declared on Earth. And there's this little, like, quiet strings movement going in the background to emphasize the chilling nature of it. That after all the big, loud, obvious action, now things are much worse. It's very quiet, and I like that. I'll talk more about that later. I've got another point related to that. But the other reason I think it was done on purpose was because it's kind of a meta thing. Babylon 5 has already proven that they are not against upsetting the status quo. They've already lost two major characters, four major regular characters, and have brought on new ones, and are not opposed to doing that. Now, I remind you, that was new when Babylon 5 came out. That was a fairly new concept, at least to American television. I need to quantify that. And so the idea of that kind of status quo can be altered thing was something that people should be aware of and know about. And so the idea here going into this is that they wanted to play with the idea that this might be a literal suicide mission, or at the very least things are going to go much, much horribly and they're going to get captured mission for Sheridan and Delenn. And there was a lot of possibilities of that actually happening, especially with the framework of the episode. So they overemphasized the leave and then cut it off to play with audience expectations. Now that still does kind of bother me, I will admit it. And it would bother me more if not for the fact that I know the rest of the series. Have to admit, though, if I was watching this brand new, I'd be like, oh, come on! Let him die! We'll see where this goes. I want to give praise to the special effects team. Obviously, the FX team has always done... Foundation Imaging, that's their name, has always done some pretty good work on the special effects of Babylon 5. For the time, I do have to add that, I do think it has aged pretty badly, if I'm 100% honest. But what I really like is the design in the approach to the animation of the erratic shadow ship. The shadow vessel that has the human in it is basically insane, as it's been described. But they don't just say that. They show that. The way it flies is literally different than other shadow vessels. Other shadow vessels have a very distinct movement to them. This one just kind of doesn't fit with that. And of course, it fires erratically, and it fires in differently than other shadow ships. Other shadow ships are very precise. This one's just... There's a difference in the approach, and it's a good visual indicator of the insanity of the ship. I like that. Also, we see kind of how the shadows got their fingertips into Earth with the excavation of the ship on Mars and Psychor being involved in some way or another. For those not aware, this is all part of a comic book series that actually came out... well, I've heard differing accounts on it, actually, but it came out before this episode actually came out, which basically recounts the same story, the shadow vessel being found on Mars. Now, I don't actually have much to say about that. What I do wonder, and this is the only thing I don't think we actually know for a start, is who was actually behind the IPX let's merge a human with the shadow vessel to try and take over it thing. One of the comments made by Kirkus, I think was her name, is that they want to make us more like them. I don't know if that was just melodramatic comment or if that's literally the kind of thinking they were going in, rather than technological augmentation, cybernetics, for example, or whatnot, or something as simple as a pair of glasses, going for a more biological augmentation, kind of like the Shadows are very good at. The Shadows have demonstrated biotech many times, and it's, as is mentioned, they need a living core for their vessel. But that brings me to another interesting question. But I'm going to wait for later. I want to keep going. So, first of all, Vaughn Armstrong. I wrote down his name, but I didn't need to. I actually recognized the actor. He's a regular over on Enterprise, and I've seen him in a few other works as well. It was so weird seeing Vaughn Armstrong playing basically the Night Watch stoolie in this episode. Especially since he tends to play that kind of warm, fatherly kind of role every other thing I've seen him in. But what I found even more amusing about it was that his name, the character that Vaughn Armstrong is playing, keep in mind he had a medium role and he had actual lines rather than just being a standard extra, was Security Guard Number 1. Yeah. But here we see the next step in the Night Watch. So they start to present undesirables as organized. I specify that undesirables, political enemies, or people who are outspoken against the new regime, or people who are, just expressing an opinion, like that shopkeeper in a previous episode. Those kind of people are labeled, have been tracked for the months that Night Watch has been growing, back at home as undesirables, and now it's the next phase of the plan. Oh my God, all those people were all organized. It was all part of a grand conspiracy from an external threat. It's so easy to label all those people as part of this, as traitors to some alien influence, some alien invasion, so that all of a sudden I don't have to worry about my own government or my own people being horrible. I could even have sympathy for these poor traitors. Or, of course, I could hate them. You can actually go both ways. These poor deluded fools betrayed their people, or how dare these people betray their people. Both perspectives are valid, but either way, both are possible because it is an external threat that is actually being presented. It's some alien invasion thing, that's all it is. It's not us. There's no threat from humans. Right? There's also this really, really interesting thing. It's probably one of the most subtle things I've seen the Night Watch do, other than the telepath thing. That was very subtle. When Talia was present at a Night Watch meeting. But no, this is probably the second most subtle thing I've seen the Night Watch do. Well, hang on. I'm paraphrasing because I didn't write down the exact quotes. Forgive me. And I was running out of room on my page for notes. Oh, hang on. Does that mean everyone's a suspect? Oh, no, don't worry. You're not a suspect. I mean, simply by virtue of being in Night Watch, you have proven to not be a suspect. So there's no worries. You're going to be perfectly safe. Now, I'm saying that very obviously, but the way the episode presented it, it was like, no, of course not. You're going to be fine. It was so subtle. So normal, I think is the word I want to use. You're safe, and as long as you stay with us, you'll stay safe, is the message. It's actually a threat if you're paying attention. Anyone who is not with us is against us. And it's said in that kind of reassuring, calm, fatherly tone. Yeah! Then there's this wonderful scene with Ivanova where she actually yells at Marcus. He's talking about the dragons that have come to gobble us up, and then the ferrets in his trousers. She, of course, blows up at him. But what I find most interesting about that scene is Marcus doesn't react to that blow-up, really. Why would he? He's good with people. And remember, this is part of his character. We've well established this in most of his previous episodes. So he recognizes that she's not angry at Marcus. She's venting because she's upset, frustrated, powerless. Can't do anything about the situation. She actually flat out says, I have no one else to blame. Which is funny because that's also not true. But he also recognizes something, and this is also true for Ivanova. Remember, she is much more by the book than, I'd say, most of the other cast members, the main cast members. She is very much lawful good. In a good way, I mean. She prefers things to be orderly and in order and order-like, and you get the idea. What I like about that is that it is actually, it's logical that Marcus literally doesn't fit in the chain of command in any functional manner, really. And that bothers her, but that's probably just like a little thing. I mean, this sounds so obvious. She's worried about Sheridan, she's worried about being powerless, she's worried about fighting their own people. So she has to fixate on this tiny little thing that's just a slight irritant. It barely bothers her. But she grows this out of proportion so she doesn't have to think about the things that are really bothering her. And that's why I like that Marcus just endures that, so she can then vent and get past that to the point where she is now venting about what is actually bothering her. And then he brings in the org chart. I know that I'm skipping forward like 20 minutes, but that was such a good scene. He comes in, okay, I'm here. You see, there's the captain, there's me. There's my parents. They're not actually part of this. It's a good picture of them. And this, I thought I'd use the basis of the Ottoman Empire as a way to do this. And what I like is that she laughs quite naturally before she realizes what she's doing, and she's like, all right, what are you doing here? And he's like, well, did I get you to laugh? And she's like, okay, fine, yeah. You win. It's a nice touch, and regardless of the fact that Marcus is obviously interested in Ivanova, I like the fact that it is a very human gesture to just try and get someone else to laugh when they are very, very worried. Let's go talk about the shadow encounter. As I said, way too much melodrama. I like a lot of things about that interaction. There's something I want to talk about, but I'm so tired right now I may fail at it, so I'm going to actually kind of shelve that for the moment. The shadow vessel uses people as a core. This is, to my knowledge, the first time we've heard about this. Why has that information not come up before? Now, let me explain what I mean by that. We, the viewers, need to get that information at some point. There always has to be a first point for us. But my point is, Delenn has clearly been aware of the fact that they need, not only that they need a core, but that person has to be specially prepared to be a core. And she has this information, and she's never volunteered it. Despite everything, I find myself wondering, how much else is Delenn keeping from the rest of the Army of Light? I have a very strong feeling that she doesn't trust the Army of Light overall. And frankly, she probably only said this because she trusts one individual. I've actually talked about this concept before. The difference between trusting a person and trusting a group. Because I think she trusts Sheridan. And I think she told Sheridan that fact without discussing how or the why or where she came by this information. And of course it was an emergency situation, so he doesn't really have time to question this, does he? Also, once again, we see Sheridan's tactics very much on display, very adaptable. He's not actually that much of a long-term planner. He's not the person who sits down and says, here is our sweeping battle strategy. He's the person who's plopped into a situation and is like, okay, let's do this. Very adaptable commander. He is, in short, a very, very good captain. And is the kind of person who should be in charge of a ship on the front lines, in the middle of a war. And he demonstrates this twice in this episode. I do love, however, the fact that Sheridan is the person who comes up with the frankly brilliant method of dealing with the shadow vessel, which I'll talk about in a moment. But Delenn is the one who figures out how to deal with the Agamemnon. Because Sheridan ran into a wall in his thinking. That's what I call it. We all know this. I'm sure you've experienced it just as much as I have. The easiest way to explain this is, I want you to picture the last time you did a puzzle, just a puzzle game or a crossword or whatever, and you just couldn't wrap your mind around it. what happens is we as people tend to run into this wall so that our thinking repeats itself. And then we run into the wall again. Well, okay, well, that didn't work. Well, that didn't work. You see where I'm going with this? This is why some people say a new perspective is helpful. You let someone else, you talk with someone else about it, or you let someone else in to look at it, or sometimes you just take a break from it. You walk away from the puzzle for a while. And this puzzle could be a literal puzzle, or it could be something wrong with your finances, or your job, or real life, or philosophy, or just a game you're playing. You know, there's lots of ways this happens. And so we see Sheridan just smash into that wall because that's the Agamemnon. I can't do anything. I can't surrender. I can't fight. It is Delenn, then, the new perspective, that gives Sheridan the answer to what needs to happen, which I find very ironic considering future events. You know what I'm talking about. Now, what else do I got? I like the fact, so the shadow thing, let's talk, that's not this, that's something else. Let's talk about the shadow thing. I like using the gravity well of Jupiter as a way to dispense of the shadow vessel. The immense gravity of Jupiter is insane, and even by the advanced technology of Babylon 5, yeah, I like the fact that it can still crush those ships past a certain depth. It was very, very risky what Sheridan did, and it actually wouldn't have surprised me, honestly, if they had just killed them off at that point, dying to kill the shadow vessel, because they would have succeeded. The shadow vessel couldn't get out any more than they could, but they got out. That's cool. That's cool. But my point is, it's brilliant not only because it does three things. First of all, it shows the characters outthinking their opponent. They are outgunned in almost every way by that shadow vessel. But they outthink that. They show Sheridan's tactical acumen, and the main characters prove to be able to take on a stronger foe, which is a good sign of good writing. Second point, it establishes something that JMS has been really hammering in. This is the second shadow vessel destroyed ever on the sake of the show. On screen, I should clarify. And both times it has been a significant effort to do so. A major effort was needed to take down one shadow vessel. He is re-emphasizing, as I would if in his position, how much it matters that these shadow vessels are stronger than everything else we've got, that it is much, much harder than anything else we've fought to take these things down. And the third thing, and this is kind of brilliant when you think about it, is this makes sure no one else can get the shadow vessel. It is now trapped in the gravity well of Jupiter. Nobody around here has the technology to reach into Jupiter and grab that thing. So if they had destroyed it elsewise in a straight-up battle, they'd have to worry about debris, about pieces being found, and the same problem they originally had they're now facing. But with it in the gravity well of Jupiter, no one's getting that ship. There's no salvage here, is what I'm trying to say. It's brilliant. Also, the atmospheric jump thing, that's not this. The atmospheric jump thing is a nice thing, too, because, we have just been part of the first atmospheric jump, and it's the first time it's been done. I do question why. I mean, someone has to be first. But it is interesting, because it'll come up in the future, the knowledge of atmospheric jumps. So let's talk about this. This show, of course, is wonderfully political. And this episode really helps to emphasize how difficult it is to make decisions. Even if it is the right decision, negative consequences can come of that. Because this is a very, very dangerous situation. They have an advantage over EarthGov, over the Clark administration. They are hidden. The Clark administration is not aware that they are their opponents. The Shadows are not aware that they are their opponents. And that is their advantage, and one of their only advantages, really. Holding on to that advantage as long as possible so you can use it exactly when it's most useful, that's a very key and critical thing. But when you're in a circumstance like that, sometimes you have to act. Sometimes you have to show the cards in your hand. And the revelation of this shadow vessel and how soon it was before it would be seen was just too dangerous and too much of a risk. It had to be dealt with. And I like the fact that some gravity is placed on the fact that this is something that nobody wants to do, but they all recognize they have to. And this is the possibility of the entire conspiracy of light and Sheridan and Delenn personally, and all of their advantages evaporating against both Clark and the Shadows. But they have to because someone called them. Someone put a sufficient amount of money on the table and said, I call. What do you got? And they had to show their cards. the political realities of this are obvious. You know, the revelation that Babylon 5 was in any way supporting an anti-Clark or an anti-IPX thing would be disastrous. There's already, shall we say, Clark supporters on board B5. That's part of what the whole point of the Zack side plot is, to show how the Night Watch is actually growing in influence, not shrinking. And then there's the military realities. If back on Earth, if the Psi Corps and the Clark administration gain access to shadow tech, that would give them such a ridiculous advantage over basically all the other players on the board, wouldn't it? Never mind the immense danger in the obvious, tinkering with things you don't understand. That's actually what happens in this episode. The IPX is tinkering with things they don't understand, and they got an insane shadow vessel as a resultant. I can't even imagine the torment of the person in that vessel, but let's move on from that. But what I like most about this, what I really, really love most about this episode, is that the good guys won. And yet, so did the bad guys. Because this show is wonderfully political, and it shows that even when the good guys win, it doesn't necessarily make things better. The Clark administration uses their victory to further their own ends and declares martial law. Martial law has now been declared on Earth. All those inquiries into Clark and the assassination of Santiago, those are gone. Those have just been cessated in the face of the greater alien threat that has now been revealed. And there's been anti-alien sentiment growing for years, probably decades, actually, back on Earth. Think about it. All that opposition, all the problems the Clark administration had. The main characters of this show had been moving closer and closer towards really exposing Clark and his administration. And they had been winning victory after victory against the Clark administration. And yet, they have just handed him the biggest victory that he will ever have. He now has martial law on Earth. He is, quite literally, the dictator of Earth right now. Good job, guys. But I don't mean that as a negative. They had to do this. But I like that this shows the consequence of that. That this whole victory was not some big melodrama, oh well, reset button, end of the week. That's what was really bothering me. When I mentioned earlier about the whole build-up thing and oh, they don't die, whatever, my biggest complaint about that is because I don't like the reset button concept in television. And I don't like the status quo being the absolute in television, or in anything, really. But what I like is the fact that even though they didn't kill Sheridan, and even though they didn't kill Delenn, and even though this was a victory, they showed consequences. The all-important consequences, and I love that. And that's why that bit at the end with that the calm news announcement and the slow, chilling music was all the more chilling. Because they understand, and we, the audience, now understand just how much of a loss this victory actually is. I got nothing else for this one. Good episode. Very good episode. Yeah, things are getting real. I'll see you next time, guys.